Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. The videotaping today is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Fund of the U.S. Department of the Interior through the Nebraska State Historical Society and the City of Lincoln, a certified local government. Please support the Preservation Association of Lincoln, and we're the organization that brings you these brown bags. And you can support us through membership. We have brochures in the back of the room, or you can also go to preservelincoln.org to join. Our speaker today is Ed Zimmer. Ed is a City of Lincoln preservation planner, a position that he's held for over 28 years. Before coming to Lincoln, Ed was a freelance architectural historian in Boston. He's a native of Omaha, Nebraska, and he has an undergraduate degree from Lindenwood College and a PhD from Boston University. Ed's talk today is titled, "This Was Lincoln, a 1928 Photo Album." Please join me in welcoming Ed Zimmer.
Thank you. Fair warning, this is a show that I have notes for, which means it's one I've never done before. So we'll all take the same risk. What I'm going to show you is a set of black and white photos from an album that was given to the Lincoln City Libraries in 1986. We don't really know much about its history before that. There's 40-some black and white images in this album, and I think about 40 of them I've never seen before. So I'm hoping that means that 35 or 36 of them you've never seen before. Usually when I do a PowerPoint, it frees me from the walking tour tyranny of geography, that you have to go place to place on a walking tour. And in a PowerPoint, you can put any two buildings next to each other you want. But to organize my thinking about this album and have a way to show it to you, I've decided to reimpose the tyranny of geography mostly, and we're going to take a walk around downtown Lincoln and Haymarket, and a little bit farther beyond that, but almost all these images will be downtown and Haymarket. Now, I'm going to violate that just a little to kind of introduce you to the album and do it through this building. This is the Swanson Russell Building, or part of the Swanson Russell Building today, but originally was Farmers Mutual. And in our image, looks like this. This is the only one I'm going to give you as an album page, but these are a simple photo album with the images pasted on the pages, and then an inscription in blue ink below, and it tells us this is the Farmers Mutual Building. Farmers Mutual was a company founded in 1891 and very active in Lincoln. They're right now building their new headquarters over on Lincoln Mall. In 1921, they had Lincoln architect A.W. Woods adapt what was an apartment building with a whole new Renaissance Revival facade, really one of the most ornate small facades in Lincoln, and turn this into their headquarters. What I love about these images is how frank they are, how straight on. Many of them have little glimpses of everyday life, and the resolution on them is just incredible. These scans come to me courtesy of the Heritage Room at Lincoln City Libraries, which holds the album, and the Nebraska Library Commission, which has a wonderful project called Nebraska Memories. And the city libraries and the Library Commission are putting these images online. I've written the captions for them, and so they'll be appearing. So you would have access to all of these through the Library Commission's Nebraska Memories website. See that car south-facing, because this is a north side of the street, means we get the back end of the car, very, very important. We can read the license plate. We can read the date. Those cars in which I can read the date and everything else about the images tell me that these were taken in 1928, maybe early 1929. Very little variation in the buildings I'm seeing. Nothing really breaks that chronology. So with chronology set, I have to kind of use geography to find our way around. And we'll start over towards Haymarket with what we call the Burr and Muir Building. And I'm going to sometimes orient you by introducing a modern image, and then we'll go to why we're here. Burr and Muir Block was built in 1888, was designed by the Lincoln architect James Tyler. Burr and Muir were partners. Burr was C.C. Burr, Carlos C. Burr, who was mayor of Lincoln. I don't know if he joined up with Muir because Muir was D.D. Burr, and they were these guys who went by their initials. One of the remarkable things in this view, we see that in the early days, the building housed Norden Labs, which grows to be a major player in Lincoln's scene. It was one of the branches of Ridenhour, which was a manufacturer in Haymarket of work clothes and overalls. But also the view is so good that we can see up above that third floor central window, which is no longer there today, the 1888 date. A little deeper into Haymarket and a little bit north, up to 8th and R Streets and the Hardy Building, which in our view of 1928 shows how really little changed that building is, but also shows us clearly that this was a three-story building of 1919, to which the top floors were added in 1927. And in our album, we can see that point at which the two buildings, not just because the frame was so clearly expressed on the lower floors, but you can see the brickwork as they melded the upper floors. Jesse Boaz Miller designed the lower three floors. Davis and Wilson designed the box to sit on top of that. I think it's kind of remarkable to think in the same year that Davis and Wilson have the Stewart Building on their drafting tables, they have the top three floors of what was called Tilden Furniture at that time. Tilden becomes Hardy, and that's why we call it the Hardy Building today. We'll see more Hardy as we go along. Moving south down 8th Street, the corner of 8th and Q, the old, what we would most often call the Tool House or the Hinkle and Joyce Building, but seeing it in the late 20s, it's already under Hinkle ownership as the wholesale hardware store, but it had been built about 1891 as a cracker factory. The company's name was Jones, Douglas and Company, and where you see the sign between the second and third floor windows on the south side, that covered up an old Jones Douglas sign, and when that sign, when this hardware sign came down, on a good day with bright light and the right angle, you can still read Jones Douglas and Company on that building from its original 1891 use. Much more clear that hardware written down the, written vertically on the west facade is very clear still on that facade. This is now under renovation. The Hilton Garden Hotel is being built on the north part of the block. It'll come down and join the back side of this building, and lower floors of this will be retail. They're talking apartments in the upper floors of this. Across this kitty corner across the street, the H.P. Law Grocery Warehouse. This is a building of 1904, and one of the few in Haymarket that was designed not by Lincoln architect, but by Cox and Schontager of Council Bluffs. I think really one of the loveliest warehouses in Haymarket with a very subtle, curled out, corbelled cornice up at the top. H.P. Law was a business that had begun in Lincoln in the 1860s. They had a remarkable series of setbacks in the 1890s, remarkable in that they survived them. They had been in the building just south of this location, the Clark Building, till it burned in 1895. They got themselves going again in the Fitzgerald block at 7th and P, just in time for it to burn down in 1898 with Beatrice Creamery beside them. They both survived the fire. Mr. H.P. Law himself had died in Germany on a trip to his homeland in 1897, and his widow, Frederica, managed to pull together the company, build this building just a couple of years later, and continue on for decades after. If we look, often the sides of these images are the special features, and if we look to the right side of this image, we see this building, which was the Coffee and Spice Annex to the H.P. Law Warehouse. the big opening there, which we can see clearly if we focus in on that detail to the side of the photo, was where rail service came right inside that building. That's an opening the size of a boxcar, because literally they could take grocery deliveries inside, and all the way through this building down to what we would call the candy factory today, but what was rebuilt as the Gillen and Bonney and then eventually Russell Stover Company just south of this. A little further south down the street, what we might call the Mill Coffee House, but in 1928 was the George Bert Company, a wholesale fruit company, one of the smallest of the half dozen grocery wholesalers in Haymarket. That name plaque on the upper left is still there and says Stacy Brothers Fruit Company. Stacy was the original occupant of the building when it was built in, I think it was 1912. Yes. This was one of the many warehouses in Haymarket designed by Ferdinand Fisk in his various partnerships. In 1912, he was with his longtime partner, Harry McGinnis. If we look, 8th Street has that very special character day up and down the street with these loading docks and canopies along the street. But that's not coffee being served out on the dock at this time. They're taking their shipments with rail service right beside the dock, and then trucks, in this instance, backed up to it. But we can see both the boxcar and the trucks using that dock. Just up the street from that, the Harper Brothers Building and Veith Building, marching east up the hill on 8th Street, on P Street, and that street in 1928. Harper Brothers were in the saddle and tack business, both manufacturing and wholesaling, and all kinds of leather goods. They survived into mid-century when they basically were an agricultural business in their early days. They connected the source of the power to the equipment through their saddles and tacks and harnesses and horse collars. Eventually, they were making golf bags and briefcases and belts, other leather goods. This view, there in the shadow of what must be the Lincoln Hotel, casting a shadow on the little building. This is the best portrait I've found of an early date of what we call the Veith Building. It has its name up on the curved cornice and the date of 1884. Veith was a grocer, had a brother named Veith who had a much bigger business, but this was the little retail grocer on the first floor with an apartment above. But by 1928, it's a cigar store. Just up the block from there, Old Chicago is in the old Lincoln Fixture and Exchange Building, and beside it what's called the Haymarket Bodega, and those are portrayed well in this view. 1924 on the Colonial Revival warehouse, a perfect Haymarket building with that very stylistic front, and then right around the corner on the side, the very frank industrial, all the structure exposed and the windows just as needed to light the floors of the warehouse. And the little building beside it, again, is not the kind of building that gets its own portrait, but it shows up on the edge of this view. And it looks like, I think the sign in the window probably has John Camp's phone number. It appears to be vacant at this moment, and he'll get a good tenant there. Across the street, the Ridenhour Building, mid-1920s, one of the last of the warehouse factories built in Haymarket. This is the same Ridenhour who was up around the corner in the Burr and Muir block, but here, having built themselves finally a large factory warehouse building, and as shown by our photographer. Diagonal parking, you'll notice, two-way traffic, historic features of Haymarket. And just a glimpse on the left-hand side of the Lincoln Hotel, where the Hilton replaces it now, today the Holiday Inn. We call the Creamery Building at the south end of that view on 7th Street, right beside the Lincoln Station or the Burlington Depot. And in its early view, when Lower two floors built in 1900 by Beatrice Creamery. They added the top 2 floors just 4 years later in 1904. And then as they were expanding, moved their creamery operation down a couple blocks south to what we call the Meadow Gold block between 7th and 8th and L and M, and then moved their headquarters to Chicago in the early teens. And a number of companies followed them there, but one of the big ones was Cornell Supply, who was a plumbing wholesaler. And we can see their wares, probably not the kitchen sink, but the bathroom sink, displayed in the windows. And I'm not exactly sure what a hot shot silent plumber was, but it's a pretty neat sign there where Indigo Bridge Bookstore would be behind those windows today. Moving down 8th Street, a little south of Haymarket proper, we come to this building at 820 N. Doesn't look like a whole lot today, but there's some detail in the brickwork. But in this view, we can see what those windows were about and what the building was about as Western Supply Company. They were another plumbing wholesaler and also supplied the windmill and pump industries. Building at this time accessed by a staircase on the sidewalk with stairs both right and left, and some real interesting pattern of windows across the upper floor. I liked this view so much better that I cheated and imposed this on the modern day facade. I didn't try to color it, but yes, I did flip it backwards. But. And then just kitty corner from that, Griswold Seed had their warehouse and seed elevator and office space. Griswold was a company that dated back, as this view from a 1923 publication shows. They were founded in 1890. About 1910, with a location at the southwest corner of 8th and N, they had a fire and replaced the burned out building with this major warehouse designed by Ferdinand Fisk, who had the broadest range of practice from mansions to warehouses and factory buildings. A very frank expression of the industrial building with the frame showing the seat elevator to the south end and almost a industrial steeple there with the top of the seat elevator and Griswold Seeds written on it. This view, if we zero in, I'm going to zero in on both the truck in the right foreground and then the building we can see off to the far left. And it isn't just parked there. I also have to notice the guy standing on the stairs wondering, should I help him? Because it appears from the tools lying on the pavement that he's changing his tire. Down the street, we can see a sign on the right that says Beatrice Creamery. We're looking down to M Street there. But Beatrice didn't control the whole block from the very beginning. They had moved down to that block in 1909, but here on the corner of 8th and M, Wilson and Company had a small facility, the meat packers. And then if we go just beyond Wilson and Company, this would be the next view in the album of Shogo Lithia Springs Company on the block. This is facing east on 8th, where there's now parking and used to be Meadow Gold trucks. The building itself is a little older than Shogo Lithia's use of it. Was built in (1907) for an outfit called Dick Brothers Brewing Company, and they had a brand called Quincy Beer. And so this was I don't know if it was really a brewing building or just a small warehouse for them. George Berlinghoff designed the building. Lincoln Architect is on the building permit. And Shogo Lithia then came in, I believe, when the earlier occupant was forced out by Prohibition. And Shogo Lithia had springs in Milford And lithia was a shortening of one of the minerals, lithium, in their water, and it was supposed to be, it probably tasted bad, so it must have been good for you. They later were supplying water from their springs for soft drink companies in Lincoln. This is 1928. If we look just beyond the building to the big warehouses on the left, that's where Meadow Gold looms over them. And you can see Meadow Gold Butter written on the taller cold storage building there. And this is a 1923 ad for the same company in that same building. And just barely in the upper left, you can see foreshortened on the south side of the building the word beer. Now this block belongs to the folks that have Laszlo's and Fireworks Restaurants and Empyrean Brewing. And they will eventually move their brewing here. And they feel very good that they're bringing beer back to the block. Had this long period in between of milk, but they're going to go back to their beer origins. And around the corner onto 9th Street, a view of the Lincoln Traction Company building. At the time when Lincoln Traction Company, the streetcar company in Lincoln, was also one of the two competing electric companies in Lincoln. During the 1920s, they were bought out for their electric generating purpose by Iowa Nebraska Light and Power Company. And this building is built by a subsidiary of the Iowa Company in 1926, designed out of their Davenport, Iowa office. And the building's still there on the southwest corner of 9th Street, just by the on-ramp to the Rosa Parks Way. In the foreground, somebody's forgotten to close their car door. And just across the street, where what we call the K Street Power Plant, or the now Government Records Storage Building is, there were billboards, including one for chick feed and the other for Diamond Walnuts. Over onto 10th and L, southeast corner, where Sid Connor, this is before Sid was in the building, has his architectural antique business. Butternut Bread built that as a bakery and shipping building, and it was built in 1916 and designed by the Lincoln architect A.W. Woods. On the north side, we can see not only the name of the company, but reflected in the windows, a sign for something across the street. So I flipped the image because it's hard to read, sideways distorted mirror image split in half. It's still hard to read, but it says something about, I think cars are polished in some organization across the street, and repairing also. Now up into downtown proper, which is, along with sort of the industrial edge and warehouse edge of Haymarket, is the heart of this collection. And here we have the Terminal Building at 10th and O, built in 1916, so it's about a dozen years old in this picture, designed by the Chicago architect Paul V. Hyland, and proudly built in just 9 months between January and August of 1916. And I know it's proud because in the lobby is a plaque boasting that they built it in just 9 months, and listing not only the architect and the owner and the contractor, but all of the subcontractors, down to the outfit that installed the built-in vacuum cleaning system in the building. This was built by Lincoln Traction Company for their primarily for the streetcar side of things, and was just a rental building for offices above. They had an appliance store on the first floor and on the mezzanine for selling the electric appliances that used the power they generated. But they also dispatched their streetcars from this building, and down on the north side, just above the canopy, you see that little bay window that projects out. There's a tiny office space behind that on the mezzanine level, and that was the streetcar dispatcher's office. And with this little bay, he was out beyond the front of the building and could see up and down O Street to spot where cars were, and most of the lines circled around Government Center block right in front of him. So ideal location for a streetcar dispatcher. Just east of it, and in its shadow sort of appropriately because it wasn't as tall. And this sort of, the pair of buildings always make me think about the race to be the tallest building downtown, which every place seems to have a little bit of. This was the First National Bank building of 1910, designed by Highland and Green of Chicago. Same Highland as Paul Highland, who designs the terminal building across the street, which is the right edge of this view. The First National Bank building at 8 stories was the tallest building downtown for 6 years. And then the terminal building across the street at 10 stories tops it and holds that position for about a dozen years until Stewart Building and Sharpe Building, 1927 and 28, exceed the height of the terminal building. When Matt Hansen was nominating this building to the National Register some years ago, we knew from the drawings that there were shops in the basement, and we should be able to see on the west side the staircase system down through the sidewalk into those basement shops. None of the postcards show it. This is one of the most postcarded buildings. It's just too small a detail, and when they color those up, they just never worried about that railing. Well, there is the railing. Not in the highest focus, but we can see it at least. The railing in the middle of the view for going down to the barber shop and Ernst Herminghouse's father's cigar store, cigar manufacturing shop down in the basement. If you walk by that building and stare very closely at the granite courses along the base of that, you can find a couple locations where you can see the circular plate of the end of those big pipe railings that surrounded this opening and the screw holes, bolt holes for holding that plate on. So we know it was there, but we have it in the photo, finally. The other edge of that photo shows us the W.T. Grant building beside. Before that was rebuilt by W.T. Grant, and now the location where the downtown senior center is. Continuing east down the block, we have Golds and Company, built in 1924, designed by Davis and Wilson. Golds was a company founded as People's Store in 1906 by William Gold, and then he incorporates in 1915, takes on his son Nathan Gold as vice president, and it becomes Gold and Company and Gold's Department Store. And this really is the beginning of their large-scale buildings, beautiful terracotta building by Davis and Wilson in 1924. North of that, across the same intersection, we have the Little Building, not an adjective, but a proper noun. Mr. Little had this built in 1907 as a mixed-use office building. In the early 1930s, Lincoln Liberty Life Insurance Company bought it and considered tearing it down, but trying to be very frugal in the Depression of the 30s, decided instead to remodel it and put a top floor on it. And that's where LAS Building is today, under that Art Deco cap, but this is the original building of 1907 by Fisk and his partner at that time, Demon of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Hotel Capitol shows up on the right side, but if we look to the left, we can see the Hotel Capitol. Harder to see the little building to the left of it, especially because it's there but not there. So we'll focus in just a little bit on that small 2-story buff brick building. And on this one, I particularly like the State Display Company's signs, showing that they really could do attractive, well, it's courteous service and attractive prices, but that's an attractive sign. One above it, maybe not as much so. Maybe they put that one up when they were brand new in Lincoln, and now they've been 10 years and it's kind of faded. East across 11th Street from the LAS building, a little building, today Continental Commons building where Dish Restaurant is on the ground floor. This is the 1950 Davis and Wilson version, putting limestone cladding on this building, which is the 1899 Richards block. There was an 1880s Richards block, which was much more fanciful and ornate, and it burned down in 1899. They kept the name and built new. Probably the north wall of this, which you can see in the alley beside the theater, was built from the rubble of that 1899 fire, because there's a whole jumbled mix of materials and stones of different sizes and shapes and finishes marching up the back alley wall of this building. This is one of the last major downtown buildings built with brick bearing walls and a timber frame. So this is still not a reinforced concrete or a steel frame building inside, but a heavy timber frame building inside. North up 11th Street to the left, we get this little collection of buildings beside Lincoln Trust Company, Annex Cafe, and a billiards parlor. And Annex Cafe got its own photo. Trying to, as I look at these, try to figure out the common thread that somebody commissioned these photos. I don't know what it is. Maybe these were all the new members of the Lincoln Commercial Club of 1928 or something. But Annex Cafe was listed in its advertisements as operated by David H. Harris. And the best thing you'd want to know about a cafe, it was extremely clean. This is where Commonwealth Bank later built their headquarters, and when that was torn down, Grand Theater sits on this and the rest of the block, the north half of the block and most of the south half of the block between 11th and 12th O and P. Continuing up 11th to the northwest corner of 11th and P, you have the old Savoy Hotel. The Savoy was built in 1887 as the Ledwith block, and at that time was just a 3-story building. And you can see on this photo that there's a real shift between the lower 3 and the top 2 floors. It became a hotel called Merchants Hotel from about 1891 to 1905. When the Merchants closed, Savoy opened a couple years later, and it operated as Hotel Savoy, adding the top floors in 1911 and the canopy in 1915, and then closing in 1931. Sam Lawrence reopened the hotel again a couple years later, so it had these pauses, resting times, in 1934, and operated as the Sam Lawrence all the way up to 1975. The lower floors remained a restaurant up into the 1980s, but the upper floors had been abandoned by that time. This is on the corner where the entrance to Embassy Suites Hotel is. Closer view of the Savoy. And then a little further east, over towards where Lead Center sits today, and this was on the address of the main building here would have been about 333 North 12th. Evans Cleaners have a pair of buildings. And what I particularly like in these is it's Christmas season, and the south building has a Christmas tree stuck up against the upper floors. Just give you that sense of better be good as you walked by it, I think. Evans Laundry was operated, and there's a billboard up the top. We can see just barely, if we already know what it says, at the top of the billboard it says O.J. Fee, F-E-E. And O.J. Fee was not what a football player charged to sign his signature, but rather was a man's name. O.J. Fee owned Evans Laundry and had this office building up around the corner facing campus, where he has a men's clothing store on the left with ties hanging in the window and a barber and beauty shop on the right. This is the Davis and Wilson design of 1927. Again, kind of a simple colonial revival doorway with maybe a little bit of Spanish colonial tile work for the roof, the false roof. if we went just across the street from Lead onto the grounds of the Torn Notebook sculpture and looked southeast, we'd see the National Research Company building in sort of its Art Deco color scheme, which was not the original color scheme. It rather was a brick and terracotta building of 1920, designed by Joseph MacArthur. MacArthur was an affiliate of Paul Hyland, who built the Terminal Building, and came to Lincoln in 1916 to supervise the construction of the Terminal Building. So he's the guy who did the 9-month building project. And then he stayed on in Nebraska. Hyland remained a Chicago architect, and MacArthur gave us several significant buildings in Lincoln and Omaha, and his two major ones in Lincoln are the Nebraska Buick Building, now National Research, and the Sharpe Building that I'll show in a minute. Now, coming back down south and we've come a little west, but geography is like that. You have to go where the buildings are. On the Sartor-Heyman corner, 1975 construction, it replaced this tall bookend building, 25 feet wide, 142 feet deep, built on one of those original commercial lots of downtown Lincoln in the original 1867 plan of Lincoln. And this was the Berkeley Building, or it was the Berkeley Building by the time it got to be 5 stories tall. Before that, the first 3 floors were built in 1909, and then they were called the Ganter Building. And then Mr. Barkley added the top 2 floors in 1915. A.W. Woods again got the commission for that, and produced this 5-story, 25-foot wide, 142-foot long building. Gained its greatest fame, or probably notoriety, a couple of years after this photo was taken, because in 1930, 6 armed bank robbers took $2.7 million worth of cash in negotiable securities from the Lincoln National Bank Company. Apparently, some of them at least were affiliates of Al Capone, and some were caught. Some of the securities were recovered, much of it was not. An interesting building, kind of stacked up tall on that narrow site. Just beside it, to the west, you can see the J.C. Penney's downtown store that later would be Wells and Frost Shoe Store. And between J.C. Penney's and the Berkeley Building, a tiny little, it looks like still wood frame 19th century commercial building. I think we're looking at clapboards, and it certainly has Italianate style brackets at the cornice. I've got a couple buildings south of O that I need to show you, and then I'll come back up to O Street. We have Herpelsheimer's, the first department store in Lincoln, at the corner of 12th and N Streets, built in 1890 for Henry Herpelsheimer, who was a Prussian, born in 1843, and came to America as a very young man, was in Lincoln by about 1880. In 1890, commissioned Artemus Roberts to design this department store, which is all storefronts along the N Street side and even around the corner, and not just on the first floor, but on the second floor as well. They lit it with electricity and called it the Daylight Store because it was so brightly lit and particularly by shining out all of that glass storefront. We see just a slice of the tower of St. Paul's Church on the upper left. This location sits just north of St. Paul's. Herpelsheimer's closed in 1931. Eventually, a tire store was built on the site and used at least the back wall of Herpelsheimer's, and then when Firestone rebuilt, the last of the Herpelsheimer bricks were gone. But that's the Firestone site today. Moving east on N Street, where Tier 1 Bank had been, this front, you have to look very closely between that wall of glass and the structural supports of the canopy, there's one long, narrow line. That's terracotta. There it is. There's what the front used to look like, should look like. Beautiful front. This was, in 1928, the Donnellys Stall Building. Stood right beside the Lincoln Theater, just to the right of it, and on the left was the Free Press Building, 19th century red brick building. This was all terracotta, was built by Olson Construction in 1925 and designed by Fisk, McGinnis, and Schomburg, who were in partnership in 1924 when the drawings were done. The occupants of the retail space below, the Donnelley Stall name comes from pharmacist Claude E. Donnelley and his partner Charles C. Stall, who provided physicians, supplies, wholesale, and retail. And we lost this facade in 2007. Maybe it's still there under the glass window. I don't know. There were a couple illustrations in the album, and I haven't shown every one of them, that were renderings, not photographs. I think the reason the Sharpe Building shows up in this architect's rendering is it's under construction in 1928. So it fits with the year of production of the album. Joseph MacArthur, our architect for the Nebraska Buick Building, young man who'd come to Lincoln to build the terminal building, was the designer of the Sharpe Building. And William Sharpe was part of the Lincoln business set, who were owners of the terminal building, the traction company, the streetcar company, and here put his own name on the building. And so I show that in order that we could get it built, I put the after photo after, where I've been putting them before otherwise. And this became then the tallest building downtown. Capitol is in its own category and always should be, until tallest office building downtown until First National Bank builds their building across the street. North across the street from Sharpe Building is Federal Trust Building, handsome Gothic revival skyscraper of 1927, McGinnis and Schomburg. By this time, Mr. Fisk has returned to solo practice and will live just a couple more years to 1930, and so McGinnis and Schomburg do the Federal Trust on their own, and a very stylish, very handsome building, still great degree of integrity, and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And we can see just beside it, although buildings that show up in other views as well, that lovely little Woods Brothers building facade just north of it. Now up onto O Street, one of the most changed facades in Lincoln, now called Lincoln Flats. And this is the, I think I'll need a little help to get my dates right on this. This is the facade treatment done just a couple years ago as the upper floors are being converted into condominiums. They're working from this 1970s redo of the front for Commercial Federal, which was the redo of this front, which is 3 floors of late 19th century retail, and then 2 floors of 1915 Fisk and McGinnis for Hardy Furniture Company. At this time in 28, they were advertising they were the oldest and largest furniture company in Lincoln, dating back to the 19th century. On those upper floors where they had Fisk design the top 2 stories, they had him also design cottages in which to display their furniture. And on the upper right, we have a couple of the elevation drawings for those little cottages to be built inside the building to display the furniture, and then a postcard view of what it looked like on the upper floors of Hardy in that period. But I also can't resist going to the lower left and looking at both August Dietz's music house, where he has band and orchestra shop, and down below it, the grand storefront or entrance for the Strand Theater, with a couple of caryatid figures holding up the cornice of the movie entrance. Wouldn't it be great to have those on O Street? Just south and a little further east, the electric building by the name on it, but if you go to the major entrance on the west side, about 2/3 of the way down, it says Chapin Building. It was built as the Chapin's Building in 19-teens. This was another Ferdinand Fisk design, although I've got a lot of buildings here. No A.W. Woods, and in partnership at that time in 1911 with John Cordner, designed the building, and it has not only Chapin Building on it, but H.A. and L.C. Chapin's names on that kind of neoclassical entrance down the street. It's been, by this time, absorbed into that company that is the Iowa-Nebraska Light and Power, that eventually becomes, with the municipal generating operation, LES, several decades ago. This is one I'd never seen, a building I hadn't known existed. It's the Service Life Insurance Company building. We're south of O. Imagine yourself just across the street south of the YWCA, on the corner where the Lincoln Community Building is now. So the residential buildings to the right in this view would be where Foundation Garden is downtown. This was constructed in 1919, and Service Life Insurance was a small company that had its office here. Looks like it's in a residential section, and it is to a degree, but if you look just to the right, that's the top of the Bankers Life Building, just a block away at 14th and N, and up in the sky is the billboard or the rooftop sign for Cornhusker Hotel. And so it's not far off, but this was still residential around it in 1928, when it was built in the teens and still in 1928. I haven't yet been able to find the building permit or the architect for this little building. And that's my bicycle. They're parked against the light post. A little further east and up north to 17th and P Streets. On the southeast corner of 17th and P, Kimball Brothers, the cemetery monument makers, had built this new building in 1928. They'd come to Lincoln in 1887 from Albia, Iowa, and prospered in Lincoln and built this very handsome, or had Davis and Wilson design this very handsome workshop, office, and warehouse for their monument business. You can just barely see it, but along the far right edge, up in the slate roof, is a window in the slant of that roof, and there was a mezzanine level studio for Fred Kimball, the artist among the brothers, who designed and sculpted some of their finest monuments. And several of Wyuka's loveliest monuments are signed by F.L. Kimball, and he would have been the man behind the north light flooding his studio. And that window's still there. This is the building where League of Human Dignity have their offices, and still a handsome building. A little further east, back to O Street, 1800 block, looking rather strange maybe that it says Ford up in the air above it instead of Chevrolet, as it said for many, many years. But this is the Husong Ford or Duto Chevrolet building. Began in 1718 when Lincoln physician George O.W. Farnham had it built. And we're seeing here the 1918 part of the building. If I played a mirrored trick and flipped this over, you see where the single columns or the single piers hit one double pier on the right edge of the view. That's where the building has kind of a seam, and it doubles itself in the or about 1921. And so it becomes almost the full block that it occupies. Ellery Davis designed this first portion on the west end when he was in his solo practice in 1917, 1918. By 1922, when he designs the next piece, he has partnered with Walter Wilson and formed Davis & Wilson, who will be the probably largest architectural firm in Lincoln through mid-century, and still today, as Davis Design, the dean of Lincoln architectural firms. So this building kind of is that transition building for Ellery Davis. On the left edge of this view, we can see some fascinating residential buildings that were tucked up 18th Street, just north of the commercial activity of O Street. A little further east on O, the Brigham Cleaners Building, probably better known by their former tenant, Planned Parenthood. Brigham Cleaners was built in 1924, has date and name plaques there between first and second floor windows. Very unusual building in Lincoln in that it's entirely clad in terracotta, and the ornament is terracotta as well. It was designed by a Kansas City architect, Ed Schneider, probably working for one of the terracotta companies that supplied the materials. This was another complete unknown to me. This was the little Apex Cleaning Building at 123 South 23rd, and that would put it just above N Street, I think on the back side of where Catholic Charities building is now, just west of the Office Max site. Facing east, this building has a building permit application that identifies George Berlinghoff as the architect, and filed with those same papers a drawing which identifies Jesse Boaz Miller as the architect. I think the signed document gets to trump the city paperwork, so I'm saying it's Miller. Davis and Miller and Berlinghoff, as far as I know, never were partnered, but I don't know quite how Berlinghoff's name got on the building permit for Miller's building. But nifty little building. It looks like such a small facade until you look at that doorway height and then the facade height. Assuming that's a regular doorway and you aren't bending over to get in, it's almost a two-story height to the building, even though it was a big, it was a workshop volume, most of it, just the front portion was the office. And then one last image, and I had to get up in the air to get everything I needed into this view. Pay attention to the little two-story red brick building on left center, but also pay attention to the gas station just below the red dot. Because Pauley Lumber Company originally had their office in the little red brick building, which still survives, and then spread out all the way down across what would now be the little strip mall and onto the Ace Hardware parking lot. And behind that beautiful facade had their workshops, lumber yard, and offices as well. Pauley had operated lumber yards in several Lincoln communities. Ludwig H. Pauley organized Pauley Lumber Company in Lincoln in 1909, and he was general manager in 1925 when they commissioned Jesse Boaz Miller and Fritz Craig to design their office, coal yard, and lumber yard and workshop at 965 South 27th Street. In the directory listing of the company, they include their father, Conrad Pauley, sons Ludwig Ray, William, and Harold, and son-in-law Adam Yost. Two of those sons lived in Hastings and Beatrice, and apparently ran the branches of the company there, but they're listed in the Lincoln directory under the Pauley Lumber Company name. And that is the last I'm showing. Remember, these will become available on that wonderful website, Nebraska Memories, courtesy of Lincoln City Libraries. And it's a wonderful site. If you put Lincoln, Nebraska into their search tool, 998 images come up, and soon it'll be over 1,000. So wonderful things there. Thank you.